I want to welcome you to our webinar today. I'd like to introduce our speaker, Gregory Nielsen, who is Senior Vice President of Dennis C. Miller Associates, and he's also CEO of Nielsen Training and Consulting. Greg is an experienced nonprofit CEO and consultant, and he is as passionate as the rest of this team about helping leaders and organizations excel. Greg previously served as CEO of the Center of Nonprofit Excellence. And when he was at that organization, he expanded its reach to serve more than 500 nonprofit organizations through consulting and professional development. During this time, Gregory also helped launch a program called Destination Excellence, which was a 6-month leadership development program for nonprofit executives, and also Circles of Excellence, which is a peer-to-peer learning program for nonprofit leaders. Greg is also a military veteran, having previously served as an officer and attorney in the United States Army Judge Advocate General Corps. And in 2016, he was named a 40 under 40 honoree by the Louisville Business First publication. So thank you for being here, Greg, and welcome everyone. And I just want to mention once again, we will be circulating a recording of the video, including the slides, in a few days from now. And if you have questions for the question and answer, please feel free to post them in the chat. If you feel like you'd like to remain confidential, send it privately to Dennis Miller, and I will make sure that Greg hears your question. So without further ado, Greg, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and thank you for everybody for making the time to join the webinar today. I know that this is has to be a busy week for everybody, Thanksgiving week. I know it's a short week, so I appreciate you making time for the webinar today. The topic today that we're going to be discussing is the road to merger success for nonprofit organizations. So as we look at this topic, this is one that I have had a lot of questions on recently. There has been a lot of interest in. Part of that is driven, obviously, by the conditions and the circumstances that we find ourselves in during the COVID-19 pandemic, but it's also driven by what I've always found to be a highly collaborative nonprofit sector. So I've always appreciated the level of partnership, the level of collaboration that exists in the nonprofit community. And I think that has also bubbled up to the surface, particularly during challenging times. A quick understanding of our roadmap of what are some of the topics we're going to be covering today. We're going to talk about merger almost exclusively, but I do want to point out that merger is just one of a spectrum of possibilities. So when we think about collaboration, when we think about partnership, and unique ways in which organizations can work together. Certainly merger is on one end of the spectrum, the far end of the spectrum. But there are a whole range of other options short of merger where nonprofit organizations can effectively partner with one another. We'll talk about some of the common characteristics of mergers, benefits, conditions for success. So what needs to be in place or what should be in place to set your organization up for success if you are pursuing a merger or a joint venture. We'll talk about some merger myths that exist out there. I want everybody leaving the webinar prepared to dispel some of those myths that exist in the community about nonprofit mergers. And then I'm going to leave you with a 5-step process. When I work with organizations that are pursuing mergers or pursuing joint ventures, there's a 5-step process that I like to use with those organizations. I'm going to share that with you, and we're going to walk through it step by step. At the end, I hope that you're prepared, that you leave prepared to examine your sustained collaborations, your partnerships in a new light, with some new tools and new resources, and you're prepared to examine, are they still serving your organization well, or are we looking to expand that footprint, expand the partnerships up to and including potential merged relationships with other organizations? At the outset, I want to point out, and this is beyond the category of preaching to the choir for everybody on the webinar today, the nonprofit landscape is rocky right now. It was rocky prior to COVID-19 and is certainly rocky now. For the organizations and the leaders that I coach and consult with, sometimes it feels as though we're all on a very rocky wooden bridge and we don't exactly know where we're heading. We don't know where the end point is, and the footing underneath us doesn't always feel the most secure. So I want to let you know at the outset that even though we're talking about merger, even though we're talking about collaboration as part of a process and giving you steps, I want to let you know that I understand and I'm empathetic to the fact that many of you are dealing with very challenging circumstances, financially and otherwise, within your organizations. And I understand that these conversations are sensitive. I understand that when we're talking about merger and giving up potentially full control of your organization or partnering with another organization, that there are issues in there that can be difficult for leaders, difficult for founders, difficult for board members to navigate. So I do appreciate that. A quick review of some of the numbers that we've seen. So why is this conversation around merger becoming so popular? Why is this one that organizations are looking to? If you look at this, this was a study done by LaPiana and Associates back in April of 2020. So really just as the pandemic was ramping up, you see that they conducted a nationwide survey of nonprofit organizations. And what they found was that 91% had curtailed or adapted their services. 18% of staff on average had been furloughed or laid off. 90% of organizations experienced revenue loss. 44% were anticipating further staff cuts. 55% anticipating further service cuts. So again, as you think about conversations around merger and you wonder, why is this so much a part of the conversation of the nonprofit landscape right now? These numbers bear that out. You have nonprofit leaders, organizations, perhaps like your own, that are facing budget cuts, that are facing staffing cuts, wondering how do we preserve our programs, preserve the impact that we have on the community, and maybe do it in a more sustainable way, in a way that is more viable long term. When I talk about collaboration throughout this webinar, and whenever I deal with collaboration with an organization, I encourage you to think about collaboration as a strategy to achieve a mission or an objective, not an end in itself. So as you think about your own strategic plan, I see a lot of strategic plans from nonprofit organizations that list collaboration as a goal. You know, increase collaboration by 10% in the coming year, increase the number of collaborative relationships by 20% in the next 3 years. In reality, collaboration is a strategy to achieve a specific mission or objective. Perhaps it's geographic. We want to expand our program from 1 state to 3 states over the next 3 years. One of our objectives to do that is to increase our collaborative partnerships tenfold, or to increase our collaborative partnerships by 3, right? When you think about it that way, the collaboration itself is a tool, it's a strategy, it's a means, it's not the end in and of itself. And as we go through the webinar today and you see some of the pitfalls of merger and you see some of the tools to set yourself up for success, I encourage you to remember that definition of collaboration as a strategy, as a tool to achieve a mission or objective, not the end in and of itself. Another definition I'll use is a sustained collaboration. So when I talk about a sustained collaboration, what I mean is it's a continuum of organizational strategies, meaning it's a spectrum of options, just like we said a few moments ago, for a structured collaboration that represents a long-term and permanent change to the operating models of 2 or more organizations. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that a lot of times when we think about partnership or we think about collaboration, it's something quick, or it's something short term. My organization will partner with your organization to carry out the following event, right? That's a one-time partnership. It's a one-time collaboration. There's nothing long-term or permanent about that. There's nothing that fundamentally changes each of our business models. When I use the term sustained collaboration, what I'm referring to is a long-term partnership, a permanent partnership that changes the operating models, changes the business structure of the organizations that are part of that partnership. So as I said, when you think about sustained collaboration, I encourage you to think of it as part of a spectrum of possibilities, several different options along the way. You see on the screen there, starting on the far left-hand side, options that are informal, short-term options, all the way on the right side to more formal, longer-term options. I group them into 3 categories, and I'm going to give you examples in just a moment in each of those categories. The first being a collaboration, right? This is a simple, informal arrangement. We may not even be entering into a contract or written instrument. We're just agreeing to collaborate in some way. As we move to the right, there are a spectrum of options that I include in the category of alliances. These are things that don't formally require us to merge the organizations, but they're more formal than simply working together as partners. And then finally, at the far end there, you see integrated organizations. That's where we're thinking about mergers. That's where we're thinking about joint ventures, parent subsidiary relationships. Let's talk about some options in each of those spectrum of possibilities. On the far left side, the items that we talked about in collaboration, that's things like a coalition or a movement. Perhaps our community is setting a goal to reduce homelessness by 25% in the next decade, right? We may have 10, 15, 20 organizations participate as coalition partners towards that goal. Informal, more short-term or defined duration, not requiring any changes to the business structure of those organizations. Collective impact, and also things like joint advocacy. So, for example, let's say that I'm an arts organization. And advocacy is important to my mission, but I understand that as an individual, small nonprofit organization, I can only have limited impact. Perhaps I want to pursue a collaboration with other area arts agencies to enter into a joint advocacy relationship where together we multiply and amplify our voice to achieve greater outcomes when it comes to advocacy. Again, more short-term, more informal partnerships in the collaboration realm. Moving over one step to the right, we have alliances. These are examples of alliances are things like shared space. So multiple nonprofit organizations coming together to share space. We see that a lot right now, particularly as organizations have been working from home. They're reevaluating. Do we need the same amount of space that we had previously? Do we need the same type of office space? Would we be more efficient if we partnered with another organization to share space? Fiscal sponsorship is another example of an alliance. Joint programming, us coming together to jointly operate a program. And then finally, administrative support. So again, thinking through as we put together our staffing structures, are there ways that we can achieve efficiency still as independent organizations, but by pooling some of our admin support functions? Finally, then, as you move to the right, and that's where we're going to spend our time for the rest of the webinar, is in integrated organizations. These are things like joint ventures, parent subsidiary relationships, asset transfer arrangements, where I may take the assets of my organization and transfer them to another organization, and then merger. All of those categories, joint venture, parent subsidiary, asset transfer, they are types of merger. So when I use the word merger, just understand that there are a spectrum of possibilities even under that term merger. Merger is more of an umbrella term to relate to integrating organizations. As I said, merger has a number of different forms. There's a number of different structures that a merger can take. When we think about or talk about a statutory merger is where two organizations come together to merge. Both organizations as individual entities dissolve themselves and they form a brand new organization that is the merged entity. That organization then has to apply to the IRS for its 501c3 status, just like they did back when they originally formed. But the two individual organizations disappear, right? Another type of merger is the transfer of assets, meaning we're going to still have an organization. So that organization A and organization B are going to merge. One is going to be the surviving organization, and the other is going to be the remainder organization. The remainder organization transfers its assets to the surviving entity, but still remains in existence. The benefit to that is if there are any long-term liabilities or if there are any long-term gifts, things like bequests, that original entity still exists to receive those gifts and manage those liabilities. It shields the surviving organization from those liabilities. And again, it's just a different structure for the merger. Liquidating transfer of assets is a little bit beyond what we're going to cover today. Consolidation of organization, very similar to statutory merger, and then parent subsidiary relationship. So again, instead of dissolving the organization, we may choose to make one organization the parent and another organization the subsidiary. A lot of the decisions and determinations as you work through a merger are dependent on things like real estate, property taxes, gift bequests, making sure that we still have an organization that's set up to receive any gifts that were in existence prior to the merger, and avoiding any liabilities or mitigating any liabilities that may be known or unknown in the process. So again, as you go through the merger process, know that there are several options to protect your organizations and to mitigate any risk. Couple of typical characteristics of merger. So I gave you all of the possible structures. The most typical one that I see when I work with nonprofits is what is similar to that transfer of assets, where there's a surviving organization and a disappearing organization. It's not a true merger or statutory merger or consolidation. Typically what we see is one organization survives, the other organization dissolves, right? The surviving organization inherits all assets, liabilities, and obligations. And as you can see from that, due diligence is going to be vital to protect the interests of both boards, to protect the interests of both organizations. And in any merger, it is always the product of extensive negotiation. A couple of common scenarios. So what leads organizations to pursue a merger? Much of what we've seen since April, financial crisis or feared crisis. If I'm concerned about the viability and sustainability of my organization, it may lead me to look for a merger partner or look for a longer term relationship to salvage or save my programs. Organizations in competition with one another sometimes choose to explore merger as a way to be stronger together than they are separately. One of the most frequent motivations in the nonprofit community, particularly for merger, is the departure of a key leader. Perhaps it's a founder of the organization, or perhaps it's a CEO who has been with one of the organizations for many years and then departs. That leads a board to think about, rather than hiring a new CEO, is this an opportunity for us to explore our business model and to think about whether a merger or a partnership of some sort makes the most sense for us? A growth strategy. So some organizations that are seeking to expand either geographically or programmatically may pursue merger as a growth strategy. Another one that I see frequently right now is the combining of affiliates. So for example, let's think of an organization that is part of a national organization. Maybe it's the Boys and Girls Club. Maybe it's a YMCA. Perhaps there are 3 or 4 YMCA affiliates within a particular state. They may decide that for efficiency purposes, for administration, leadership, resource purposes, they'd like to merge those entities. So the combining of affiliates is something that we see frequently right now in the landscape. A struggle to recruit and retain board and staff is a motivation. And then occasionally it will come up as a suggestion of a funder. So perhaps there is a large foundation or a large donor that is funding multiple organizations across the community that puts a suggestion out there or plants a seed with the organizations. Have you ever considered a more formal relationship with organization B? So again, sometimes these are just the common scenarios that lead themselves or lend themselves to nonprofits pursuing mergers. A couple of the common benefits that are sought in the merger process: program preservation. Again, if I'm afraid that my program that I believe strongly in, that I've worked passionately to develop, is vulnerable, trying to make sure that I preserve that program, make sure I expand that program into another area, is a common benefit that's sought. Heightened impact, obviously, reduced administrative costs, stronger strategic positioning. So again, thinking about, are we stronger together than we are separately? And then finally, stronger board and staff. So it's important at the outset of a merger to have a conversation as a board, have a conversation as a senior leadership team with, if we're pursuing this as a strategy, why are we doing that? What are our chief benefits sought? What are our motivations? How aligned are our motivations between board and staff and between organization and potential partner? So having those conversations, bringing that to the surface, is critically important. A couple of conditions for success. So recently, the Bridgespan Group, which is a national organization, studied nonprofit mergers in 4 states over an 11-year period. What they found is that the organizations that were most likely to benefit from mergers are those that, and there are 3 situations, those that compete with others to offer similar services, right? That makes sense. If we bring those two together, we remove that competition between organizations, we can pursue those resources, pursue those assets together. Second is organizations that are asset intensive, meaning they're dependent on skilled employees. They own large facilities, such as schools, such as gyms. They benefit from a common administration or common management. And then third, organizations that are bound by regulations that dictate how services are reimbursed, staff members are certified, and facilities are licensed. That's one of the reasons we see so many mergers in the healthcare space, right? Highly regulated, licensed, skilled employees lends itself to the possibility of merger because of the advantages of administrative efficiency. Couple of common myths. I want everybody to be prepared to discuss these myths at the end of the webinar, because they are out there. They're in our boardrooms. They're in our senior leadership teams. I hear them all the time. The first myth I want to mention is that mergers save money, right? A lot of times I hear board members say, you know what, we should pursue a merger because if we merge with another organization, it's going to save us money. Instead of paying for 2 bookkeeping systems, we'll only be paying for 1. Instead of paying for 2 CFOs, we're only going to be paying for 1. That's a myth, right? A lot of times we're putting together a larger organization. That larger organization may require a more robust infrastructure. And a software system like QuickBooks may have been sufficient for the bookkeeping needs of organization A. But when you put it together with organization B, that robust organization now requires a more sophisticated bookkeeping system. So again, over time, mergers tend to, those costs tend to level out, but at least in the short to medium term, mergers, and all of the data backs this up, mergers actually cost more money. Not to dissuade organizations from doing it, because there could be any number of other reasons to pursue a merger, but cutting costs in the short and medium term is not a reason to pursue a merger. Second common myth is there are too many nonprofits. I hear this often from funders, philanthropic foundations, donors. There are just too many nonprofits. I wish that a bunch of them would just merge together so that they could be more efficient, right? If we look out into the community, the issue is not that there are too many nonprofits. The issue is not that we have too many organizations serving the homeless. The issue is that we don't have the capacity within any of those organizations to meet the full scope of the need, right? So perhaps it's not merger that's the solution. Perhaps the solution is resources, capacity, efficiency, different ways of working together in partnership, but merger is a tool that is not necessarily equipped to remedy that situation. The third myth I hear about frequently is a merger of equals, right? I have worked with a lot of organizations on mergers, and almost every time they come to me, they say, you know what, we are 2 vibrant, strong organizations. This is going to be a merger of equals. Inevitably, when you get into digging into the organizations, you do the due diligence, you look at one organization, you look at another organization, inevitably one organization is stronger than the other, right? Inevitably, there is one organization that is in a better financial position. It has a more stable staff, has a better performing board. Any number of those factors. Typically, we do not see mergers of equals. Typically, we see one stronger organization and one slightly smaller or slightly weaker organization when we're thinking about merger. The next myth, and I encourage you to avoid this, is the all-encompassing merger agreement. Sometimes organizations think that as they negotiate the merger agreement, they have to negotiate every single point, every single detail of how these 2 entities are going to merge and work together. In reality, the merger agreement, I encourage you to think about that as the frame of a house. It's not how we're going to decorate the rooms, right? It is how we're going to build the frame of the house. How are we going to work together legally? What's our structure going to be? How are we going to staff the organization? What will the boards look like? What will the financials look like? That's what we think about in a merger agreement. Thinking through every minute detail is really for the execution phase. So organizations that try to hammer out every single detail in the negotiation phase inevitably derail themselves or wind up in a situation where the negotiation process outlives the benefits of the potential merger. And then finally, the final merger myth is the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. We would all love for a merger to go so smoothly that on day one of the fully merged organization, that organization is prepared to burst forth from the gates and have a tremendous impact on the community. In reality, it's putting together a brand new organization. And just like any new company, any new business, any new organization, it's going to take some time to grow and develop and get its sea legs, right? So sometimes it's a mistake to think about how the merged organization is immediately on day one going to be stronger than either of the two merging partners were individually. That merged organization is going to take time to grow and develop, and it's going to need that space to go through some growing pains. A couple of often overlooked costs when you think about merger. Three most common costs that I review with boards are: number one, the opportunity cost. Pursuing a merger takes time, it takes resources, it takes capacity, it takes the board and senior leadership's attention to a significant level. And they have to be prepared to devote that time and devote those resources to the process. So the opportunity cost is a board and organization have to discuss, what will we not be able to do, or what will we have to let go of during this period of investigation on the merger? Because we can't invent extra hours in the day, right? And if we're devoting our board's time and our senior leadership's time to pursuing the possibility of a merger, there may be other things, other aspects that we've wanted to pursue in our strategic plan that we may have to pause for a period of time because we need to focus the energy and the resources of the organization on the potential merger. There may be infrastructure needs for the merger itself. I mentioned a few of them: IT, bookkeeping, financial, any of those kind of broader infrastructure needs that would be necessary to build a larger organization. And then the third merger cost that is often overlooked by boards is heightened salary requirements. Lots of boards that I talk to think about and assume that the senior leadership team of their organization is simply going to slide over into the senior leadership team of the merged organization. When in reality, if I am the CEO, if I am the CFO, if I'm the marketing director of an organization with a $500,000 budget, and then all of a sudden we merge and I'm the CEO of an organization with a $5 million budget, my salary needs, my salary demands as the leader of that organization are going to be materially different, right? We may also need to add staff to the merged organization. Individually, neither of us may have needed a CFO or a marketing department. But once we're a merged organization, we're larger and more robust, there may be additional staff positions that need to be created. So again, those costs have to be taken into account during the merger process. It's important in any merger that you talk with your boards, talk with your senior leadership teams about what are our individual lanes. How do we maintain those lanes of integrity? How do we avoid stepping on one another's toes? What we know from the research is that 95% of successful mergers were driven by the CEO of the organization. So the original suggestion may come from a board member, the original suggestion may come from a funder, but when it comes to the daily ongoing process of negotiating, exploring, evaluating, integrating organizations, it's the CEOs that have to drive that process. Certainly the board is going to be involved. The board may be part of the merger committee. Funders may be involved. They certainly have to be communicated with. But in terms of driving the process for successful mergers, what we know is that 95% of successful mergers are driven by the CEO of the organization. Now I want to talk through with you the 5-step process that I use with organizations that are pursuing a merger. The 5 steps are: number 1, the opening of the door. Number 2 is digging around. Number 3 is negotiating the agreement. Number 4 is obtaining legal recognition. Number 5 is integrating and evaluating the merger itself. Let's go through each of those steps individually. At the outset, someone has to open the door, right? Mergers don't just pop up out of nowhere. Sometimes the suggestion comes from nowhere, but the door has to be opened. Either a board member has to suggest it, or a CEO suggests it, or a funder suggests it. Someone typically has relationships with another organization that says, you know what, I'm operating a food pantry over here. I know we have a relationship with other food pantries over there. Have you placed a call, or should we sit down and have a cup of coffee and talk about, are there ways in which we can work more closely together as organizations? My recommendation at step one in terms of opening the door is leave the word merger out of the conversation. We talked about how merger is part of a spectrum of possibilities. The opening of the door step is really to get to know someone else, right? Maybe it's a current partner of yours, maybe it's an organization that you're aware of. But merger is such a, that would be like meeting someone for the first time and saying, you know what, I'd like to sit down and talk about marriage with you. We wouldn't do that in our personal relationships. It's the same way in merger conversations. Opening the door is really about, I operate an environmental organization. I know you operate an environmental organization too. Can we set up a call or set up a cup of coffee to talk about our individual organizations and see if there are any synergies? See if there are any opportunities for us to work more closely together. That's what we mean by opening the door. During this phase, during this step, I encourage leaders to pay attention to several factors. So these are the things to keep your radar attuned to, keep your antenna up for. Pay attention to past collaborative experiences, both for your organization and the other organization. What's been your experience with collaboration in the past? Has it gone well? Has it gone poorly? Are there any battle scars to be aware of? If it has gone poorly, what were some of the common characteristics that caused it to go that way? If it's gone remarkably well, think about what have we done well in our past collaborative experiences that we want to carry forward into this one. So pay attention to those past experiences that you may have had. Second thing to pay attention to is the board CEO relationship. And again, all of these are both in your organization and in the organization that you're having discussions with. A merger is an extended process that is going to test the board CEO relationships, right? If your board CEO relationship is not in a healthy place, or you're not on the same page, or there's tension or dysfunction there, a merger or a collaboration discussion is going to expose that. So my recommendation for organizations is, before you go down this path, make sure your board CEO relationship is in a healthy place. Make sure there can be open lines of communication, because a merger is a stressful process. It's a lengthy, difficult process, can be challenging, can be rewarding, can be extremely fulfilling, but is going to test that relationship throughout the process. Third thing to pay attention to is, can your organization and can your partner organization speak with one voice? One of the challenges that you all know well in nonprofit organizations is that we have a lot of stakeholder groups, right? We have staff members, we have volunteers, we have donors, we have supporters, we have lots of board members, we have lots of different stakeholder groups. One of the things that is necessary in a merger discussion, a productive merger discussion, is the belief and the knowledge on both partners that we're speaking with one voice. That when I'm having a conversation as organization A with organization B, that you can rely on what I'm telling you as being the official voice of the organization. You're not hearing a separate message when you talk to a board member than you are when you talk to the CEO of the organization. So pay attention to that ability to have a consistent message and to be able to speak in one voice. Current conditions of the organization, you always want to evaluate how much alignment exists between our two organizations. So if my organization is in financial crisis and yours is thriving, we want to know that at the opening the door phase, right? Because that may affect our timeline, that may affect the way we structure the merger, that may affect any liabilities that exist. Our risk tolerance, talk with your potential partner. What is their tolerance for risk during the process? And then finally, what is their timeline? So if we're thinking about working together more formally, if I want to do it in 6 months and you're in no rush and want to do it in 2 years, we have a mismatch, right? Let's get that on the table early. Let's talk about what our respective timelines are early in the process. Something else for your board to think about is, do you want to facilitate the process internally, meaning we are going to handle these merger negotiations, these discussions ourselves, either through our senior staff, through our board, or through a combination of the two? Or do we want to engage a consultant and or a facilitator to guide that project, to guide that process for us? Again, organizations do it both ways. Both ways have been successful, but it's important to have that conversation as a board. Do we have the bandwidth? Do we have the resources to manage this internally? Or would we be better off bringing in a third party to help us manage this process more effectively? A quick did you know? According to Harvard Business Review, 70% of corporate mergers fail due to some combination of culture, ambition, and strategy getting misaligned. So as we go through this webinar, if you wonder, why is Greg paying so much attention? Why is he harping on organizational culture, paying attention to all of these factors behind the scenes? Why I'm paying attention to that is because if you look at the data, and this is on the corporate side where there's ample resources financially to make a merger happen, 70% of mergers failing due to some combination of culture, ambition, and strategy getting misaligned. So again, if we want to facilitate a successful merger process, we're going to pay attention to those three areas. Organizational culture, what is the ambition, motivations of the organization? What are our respective strategies, and how well do they align with our partner? Identifying partners. So often nonprofit leaders will approach me and they'll say, we're interested in a collaboration with other organizations. We're interested in considering a merger. We don't know where to start. Who is a potential partner? Do we pick up the phone and call another organization? I encourage organizations to start with past and present partners. Who are you working with in the community today? Who are you aware of? Who do you respect? Who has complementary programs and services to what you offer, either in your local community or in a geographically desirable place for you to expand into? Successful mergers move at the speed of trust. So if we want to facilitate a successful merger, the more we can build trust, both at the outset of that process and throughout, the more likely we are to be successful. Step 2 is the phase of digging around, right? This is where we're poking around under the hood of our respective organizations, trying to learn more about each other. I recommend that in step 2, the first thing you do is form a merger committee. Typically, the merger committee is composed of the CEO, one or more board members, ideally the board chair if he or she is willing to participate, and perhaps one or two senior members of the staff team, right? This is going to be the entity, you can call them a committee or an ad hoc task force that is going to be chartered and emboldened to pursue these negotiations, pursue these discussions with a partner. Many organizations at the outset of step 2 will require a partner organization to execute a confidentiality agreement, which simply states that anything that our organization learns about your organization during this process of investigation and looking around will be held confidential. So I don't have to worry about you disclosing anything that you find out about us. And mutual exchange of information. So what types of information will we be exchanging during this process? What am I willing to turn over to a partner during the due diligence phase? What am I not willing to turn over to a partner? Considerations of culture and change. So how reluctant or how much does my organization embrace change? How resistant is my staff to change? And then finally, if the merger does move forward, typically there will be an intent to merge resolution, and I'll touch briefly on what that means. Regardless of what happens with the merger committee, the merger committee should be empowered to make a recommendation either to move forward with a merger or to abandon the effort, right? We should not be forming a merger committee and only giving them a charge to execute a merger agreement. They have to be free to do the due diligence that leads them to make a fully informed recommendation of this is a good idea to go forward, this is not a good idea, and we should move away from this, right? So even if they decide that, you know what, for whatever reason, this is not a good fit or merger is not right for our organization right now, there is value in that self-exploration. There's heightened self-awareness. There's unearthing other partnership opportunities. Maybe merger is not right, but we've identified other ways that we might be able to work together. And then there's also the team growth. So if you think about that merger committee being comprised of board members, staff members, CEO, there's value in that team working together on this process. Items that you want to look for in the due diligence phase include governance and values, documents there, licenses and accreditation, tax implications and documents, what real physical and intellectual property is owned by each organization, what do their financials look like, their contracts, what are their long-term and short-term liabilities and agreements look like, HR, how do they handle human resources issues? Are there any known liabilities on the HR side? And what is the exposure that you would be obtaining, or the exposure that you would be have from a risk standpoint? 5 key questions for organizations to answer during the due diligence phase. Will this merger result in better quality, greater efficiency, or more comprehensive service? How do we complement one another? How are our philosophies and cultures similar or different? Will we be more sustainable as a merged organization? And then finally, what does the cost structure look like short term and medium term? Right? So for organizations, and often this is what, when I'm working with a merger committee and they're about to report back to the full board from their due diligence, a lot of times we'll organize their report in accordance with these 5 questions. Right? Because ultimately that's what the board is trying to answer, is these 5 questions. Does it make sense for us to move forward? I encourage merger committees to pay attention to both items that are visible and items that are invisible during the due diligence. It's really easy and tempting to focus on the things that we can see, feel, and touch. Right? What does their building look like? What do their offices look like? What do their computer systems and technology look like? What are their financials, the documents, things that we can see, feel, and touch? That's the easy part of due diligence, right? Systems, technology, policies, and procedures. The wise organizations, the smart mergers, focus equally on things they can't see. What's the leadership style of the other organization? How do they make decisions? What's their decision-making process look like? Do they have a value of inclusion? If my organization highly values inclusion and inclusiveness, to what extent does my partner organization value that? Issues of trust, right? Values, how do they resolve conflict in these organizations? Those are the things that are far harder to evaluate, take more time, but in the long run are potentially more significant. At the end of the process, if the merger committee recommends pursuing negotiations, pursuing a merger agreement, what happens is there is oftentimes an intent to merge resolution. So each board will execute an identical merger resolution, which says, you know what, we're about to enter into negotiations for a merger. We both promise mutually that we're going to do so in good faith. Here is how we're going to inform our stakeholders. So both organizations have a common understanding of what are our communication expectations. We're going to be exclusive in these discussions, so that if organization A is having merger discussions with organization B, I'm not also out there having merger negotiations with organizations C and D, right? Exclusivity in those discussions. Merger fundraising is a group effort. So I told you, mergers cost money. Both parties need to bear those costs, right? Those fundraising for those costs is a group effort. That's often in the intent to merge resolution. And then finally, the board needs to delegate the authority for the negotiation to the merger committee itself. A key tip, and I've alluded to this a couple of times, is to pass a separate short-term budget for the merger itself. Oftentimes, we try to shortcut this process. We try to do it with existing financial resources. We try to do it on the cheap, right? Mergers require resources. They require an expenditure of funds. So make sure that you have an appropriate, thoughtful budget in place for the merger. Next, moving to step 3, which is the negotiation of the agreement. The typical things that we want to see in the merger agreement itself are, what is the timeline for the merger? We want the parties to agree on that. 6 months, a year, 2 years, whatever that timeline is. What will be the mission and vision of the new merged organization? Are we going to adopt the mission and vision of one of the two partners, or are we going to be creating a brand new mission and vision for the merged organization? How will we choose the board of directors of the new organization? Will Will everybody roll into a new board? Will we select 3 from each board and then have additional seats? How are we going to select the board? Here is the question that is often the one that trips organizations up, can be the most sensitive in the negotiation. Who's going to be the CEO? We likely have 2 successful CEOs that are having these conversations, are part of the merger committees. It's a very sensitive conversation to talk about in the new merged entity, who is going to be the single leader, if we have one, who's going to occupy that CEO role, and conversely, what's going to happen to the other person, the other CEO. What does the budget look like for the merged organization? What will be the name, the location, corporate structure, and then what programs will survive, what programs will be investigated, what programs will be halted or disbanded. So these are the topics that are in the negotiation agreement itself. What I recommend after the agreement framework is created, so after the 2 merger committees sit down and iron out those topic areas, that's when I would recommend, and I always recommend to each organization to bring in an attorney. Perhaps you have an attorney that you've worked with in the past. Perhaps you have one local to your community that you have a relationship with. It's best to take that merger agreement and have it reviewed by counsel, right? And what they're looking for there is the sufficiency of the agreement, meaning have we covered all of the legally required terms in the agreement in accordance with your state law? Are there any collective bargaining issues? Lots of times organizations aren't aware of any collective bargaining issues. We want to make sure that we're not interfering with any collective bargaining agreements that each organization has in place. Does the merger present any antitrust considerations? Are there any concerns there that we need to be aware of before we ratify the agreement? And then finally, does the agreement itself properly manage property in a way that mitigates any tax implications? So again, that's a very specialized area. We want to make sure that someone who's trained, an attorney, has eyes on that agreement. Assuming that goes well, we pass the legal review phase, we move to ratification. What happens is each merger committee goes to their respective boards and makes a recommendation. Assuming that recommendation is to move forward, that proposed agreement that we just discussed is presented to the full board. At that point, the merger committee disbands and the boards vote. They're going to vote yay or they're going to vote nay. And if they vote yay on that, I encourage you to think about that yay vote as an agreement in principle. We're not done yet, right? It may seem like we're done, but we're not done yet. That's an agreement in principle. It moves to the next phase, which is legal recognition, which is step 4 of the process. What we want to do at that point is to prepare the documents in accordance with state law. Many states have a requirement that you file a certificate of merger. For example, you may need to change the name of the organization with the Secretary of State. If you have a technical merger and both organizations are dissolving, you're going to need to file a new 501c3 application. So step 4 are the things that need to happen for legal recognition. Finally, step 5 is integration and evaluation. We have now executed all of the legal documents. It's go time. It's time to put these 2 entities together. And what we're focusing on here is executing our plan, intentionally determining our publicity level, meaning as a merger, do we want to shout this from the rooftops because we're super excited about this? Or do we want to be more low key in our publicity? So having those conversations as a board, making sure we create the infrastructure and technology that is necessary for the organization, create staff processes, policies, and procedures, paying attention again, culture and habits, and brand new board dynamics. That's a great time for a board retreat. That's a great time for a new board to come together and think about how are we going to govern this new entity as a team. I recommend organizations, just like we put together a merger committee, after the integration is a great time to put together what I call an integration team. They coordinate the integration process, again, representatives from both parties. They create and maintain that integration plan, think project management, manage the communications, that keep a strategic focus, and perhaps most importantly, they represent a single point of contact to monitor and log any issues that occur with this new entity, this new organization. 10 common areas of integration are board, management, finance, program, staff, HR, fundraising, communications, technology, facilities. Again, you could come up with a list of 50, but the 10 most common areas to integrate within the organization are captured there. I mentioned organizational culture before we wrap up, and I'm going to take questions in just a moment. Again, a note on organizational culture. Make sure that we celebrate old stories. So as we create a new culture together as a merged organization, remember that people are coming from different organizations. Change is difficult. We want to celebrate the traditions of each individual organization and also create new traditions together. Consistently communicate the cultural values that will be part of the new organization. Discuss your traditions, define success together, and establish pit stops and guardrails. What I mean by pit stops and guardrails is how will we know that this merger is effective? How will we know that it's meeting the goals and benefits that we sought at the outset of the process? And what do we do if we see issues arise? What do we do if there are problems or bumps along the way? What are our guardrails and how are we going to address that as a new organization? I recommend don't ignore any elephants in the room. It can be difficult and people can be tiptoeing during a merger process and during that integration phase where we're getting to know one another as a staff, getting to know one another as board members. My encouragement is to keep an open line of communication. If there are conflicts, if there are concerns or questions along the way, keep an open line of communication so that they don't blow up into major issues. The more we can resolve issues early on, the more likely the merger is to be successful in the long term. And then finally, I encourage organizations to establish what I call EIs, which are effectiveness indicators. So if this merger is successful, what will we expect to see in the short or long term? Document those, create some sort of dashboard or monitoring plan so that you can tell, is this having the benefits that we thought we would have when we entered into the agreement? In summary, I encourage you to think of sustained collaboration as a spectrum of options up to and including merger. Understand the ecosystem of both organizations before entering into those negotiations. Avoid the traps of those merger myths that we talked about. The 5-step merger process. Remember the differentiator. The differentiator is organizational culture. Those that pay attention to organizational culture are far more likely to succeed in the merger process. And then finally, know your EIs. If you have any questions, I'm happy to stick around now. Let's talk about them. Let's answer those questions now. All of my contact information is up on the screen. You'll also get copies of the slides. I am pleased to be a member of Dennis's team. Dennis C. Miller and Associates does a phenomenal job. I appreciate them giving us a platform for the webinar today. And I appreciate you all making time in your busy schedules to join us. Michelle, I'm going to turn it over to you for any questions.
All right, Greg, thank you so much. That was so full of wonderful information. And once that recording is ready, I know there are a bunch of people I'm going to share it with who didn't even make it to today. I think it can really help a lot of people. One question that came to me was, as you're in your experience, what have been some of the red flags that you've seen where you thought, maybe this is not a collaboration, a merger that should go forward?
I think I go back to that organizational culture piece because that's often the most difficult to identify in the due diligence phase, and it can lead to derailing the merger itself. So again, when you see, and it doesn't have to be that one organization has I encourage you to avoid thinking of it as good and bad. Right? It's not that one organization's culture is good and the other is bad. It can be that they're just vastly different. The way they make decisions, their level of collaboration, their cultural values as an organization just don't line up really well. That's far more difficult to negotiate. That's far more difficult to navigate than if we simply have two different accounting systems. Or if my organization uses Macs and your organization uses PCs. Things like that, we can navigate, we can negotiate our way through. Issues of culture, if they're ignored at the outset or if they're not identified at the outset, can really lead to long-term problems in a merger fit.
Another question came up earlier in the presentation, you talked about three different types of the collaborate, alliance, and integrate. And then later you talked about opening the door. Would you recommend maybe as part of opening that door, collaborating on a couple of small things just to kind of feel out and see if the cultures do mesh?
Absolutely. So that's almost like the dating phase, right, Michelle?
Right.
Before we enter into a relationship, before we're exclusive with one another, let's go grab a cup of coffee. Let's have dinner together. Let's get to know one another, and test this out and partner together. Maybe it's partnering on a particular program, or maybe it's piloting a specific project where you can get a better sense for how well do we work together. Do we have the same values? Do we have the same way of going about things? Are there areas that complement one another where we can learn from each other? And what does that experience look like for us? So often that's a great observation, Michelle, and it's a great way to just begin that relationship, begin that process.
Okay, well, I see one more question, and then I think we're ready to wrap it up.
Okay.
Going back to the communications element, and actually, I'm kind of personally interested in this because
Yeah.
I work on the communication side with a lot of organizations. Do you have any, I don't want to say guidelines because I know every organization is different and would want to handle their things differently. But what are your thoughts on how things should be communicated? As you mentioned, there's lots of stakeholders. So
Right.
what are your thoughts on communication within the organization and with outside stakeholders? What are your thoughts on that?
So I'm going to break it down into two different responses, into internal communication and external communication. Internally, I highly recommend that you over communicate. There is I've seen organizations try to do it, and it almost universally fails to try to negotiate or try to conduct merger conversations or negotiations completely in secret, right? It never works out. Your staff members, your organizational stakeholders, they're passionate about your organization. The word is going to get out. It's best to communicate frequently throughout the process. Communicate what you know, communicate what you don't know, and communicate your timelines, right? So at every step of the process, there are things that you can tell your internal stakeholders, your staff members, your
Mhm.
volunteers. There are things that you can tell them, and there are things that you just don't know yet. So at step one, we've opened the door. So I just want to let you know as a staff that we're having some conversations with this other organization across town. We don't know yet where those conversations are going to lead. We don't know if they're going to lead anywhere. But I do want you to know that over the next couple of weeks, you may see me out in the community meeting with the CEO of this organization. We're just exploring how we do things. Step two, we found that we work well together. We're going to be exchanging some documents. You may have a request from senior leadership team or your manager to produce some reports that we're going to be turning over to this other organization. Again, thinking through over communicating. People are far more likely to get on board when they feel as though they've been included in the process. So that's internal communication. External communication, in my view, requires a commonality of purpose and a common understanding between the two partners, right? I don't want in any merger one organization to be shouting from the rooftops and talking to their donors and their volunteers about the potential for merger, and the other organization is deadly silent.
Mhm.
Right? Ideally, we want to have a common understanding of who we're going to be communicating to, our common talking points, and that we're aligned in that process. Right. So again, external communication, a little bit different from internal communication, and it can also be a product of the condition of the individual organization. So some mergers we're super excited about. They're going to expand the geographic reach. They're going to expand our program impact. Other mergers take place because of a controversy or a scandal or a departure of a key leader. And we may not want to draw attention to the merger itself. We may not want to be on the front page of the newspaper for merging these two organizations. So again, it's really a product of those conversations to say, how do we want to communicate? How loudly, in what, using what channels, and what are our key talking points for the public?
Mhm. Super. Well, that wraps up our questions. Again, Greg, I want to thank you so much. This was just really a terrific hour of information.
My pleasure, Michelle.
And happy Thanksgiving, everybody. Have a wonderful holiday.